Hello, my name is Joe Hughes, sometimes known as Radio Joe. I'm looking forward to the annual IAQ Training Institute Healthy Building Summit, October 20 and 21, 2016 at the beautiful Seven Springs Resort in Somerset, Pennsylvania. We've moved the event back a little bit so that people can bring their family or come alone and enjoy the change of colors and the leaves during the fall season here in the beautiful Laurel Highlands of Pennsylvania. This is our third year at Seven Springs, and we are going to show you in a moment some free examples of presentations from 2015's Healthy Building Summit, where the theme is Research to Practice. Again, this year we're going to have Research to Practice presentations with professionals that will help you build the latest research into your practice as IEQ, disaster restoration, building science, and energy professionals. I look forward to seeing you here at the end of October. You can learn more about the event at iaqtraining.com, or you can call us at 814-754-4808. Look forward to seeing you here in the Laurel Highlands of Pennsylvania.
Overuse of sustainability has led to a lot of greenwashing. And so we do things that we think are good to make buildings healthier, but maybe they don't actually. And to make that really concrete, I want to do two examples: paints and plants. Okay, so if you have a question about what's the greenest paint, if someone were to ask you, say, hey, you know something about buildings, what's the greenest paint? What are you going to tell them?
Forest green.
Forest green, that's a good answer. Yeah. So a lot of people here would say, you know, low VOC paint. That's a good option to go here. So, you know, low VOC paints, they smell less, they dry faster, they definitely have fewer VOCs, total less amount of VOCs in them. And so that all seems good. But if you look at the research, and this is an article that came out earlier this year, where these researchers, this is in Austria and Germany, took about 30 or 40 low VOC paints and some conventional paints, and they painted some drywall with them and looked at what was emitted coming off them. And what they found is that the overall VOCs emitted were much less, but the specific VOCs that were emitted were much more of a health concern. So smaller amounts of VOC, but potentially more dangerous VOCs. They saw a lot more semi-volatile compounds that were just now getting to understand that maybe that's a bad thing from a health perspective. They found increased formation of acetic acid, which is actually more of an occupational concern for people who paint for a living. And the thing that really got me in their paper was this poor ventilation recommendations. Because low VOC paints dry faster and smell less, people occupy the spaces faster. And in fact, some of the low VOC paints say you can do that. And it turns out that's actually increasing exposure because they're just VOCs that don't smell. And in fact, the recommendation from this paper was in environments that have sensitive individuals, you should have a lot of caution before using low VOC paints. So I think that goes contrary to at least everything I know from you know, everyone thinks low VOC paints are green. So the even greener answer, of course, is to use a no VOC paint. And no VOC paints, the way you get a no VOC paint is you use something like linseed oil as the base. Linseed oil, to a chemist, is very unsaturated. It's got a lot of carbon-carbon double bonds in it. That means ozone loves to react with it. And so there was some research a little over a decade ago that looked at some of the potential for ozone linseed oil reactions in paints. But then more recently, Jorn Toften, who did some of the original work on TVOCs that I'll come back to a little bit later, he did some research where, again, they painted a bunch of walls with no VOC paint, and then they put in kind of low, moderate levels of ozone, like would be typical on a high ozone day outside, but what would make it inside the building. And they found that you got more PM 2.5 because ozone reacts with some unsaturated compounds and forms particles called secondary organic aerosol, and you would exceed EPA standards, WHO standards, simply from using no VOC paint. So the answer here, at least in my opinion, is you should use ordinary latex paint. It's the greenest option. And wait as long as you can before occupants.
And then was able to work with his social workers and community people to do remediation in the homes, clean them up. Kids are off all the meds, no more emergency visits, instant response. And he realized at that time that healthcare needed to change its model and not be a reactionary model, not wait for somebody to show up in the clinic and be symptomatic, but are there things we can do to try to specifically identify the risks ahead of time, either through just direct interview with them or based on what we're seeing, what's being presented to me in clinic, are there clues that I should be looking for, and how can he get his other fellow physicians and providers, he's an allergist, how can he get them to change their paradigm and take this same kind of thinking in their clinical practice. And I've been with him now for 15 years, and it has been an uphill climb the whole way. The whole school of thought in allergy is, back then, was environment doesn't even play a role. You just are genetically predisposed to have that allergy, and that's the way it is. And he's really had to work for the last decade and a half to try to change that thinking. Fortunately, there's a lot of other environmental health researchers that have developed evidence that he's been able to use to support why the clinical practice should change. And other like-minded allergist physicians, public health folks, have helped to support that. So you're really starting to see a paradigm shift. There's a very specific interest in taking a preventive approach and upstream thinking towards medicine.
And that's now being pushed even more with the Affordable Care Act.
Exactly right. So a key component of the Affordable Care Act is to change the whole philosophy of healthcare in this country. And regardless of your support or no support for Obamacare, the one thing that it is trying to drive the health management plans, the physicians, everybody to think about is what are the more effective approaches to clinical practice, to getting people to own their illness, to take care of themselves, and then this recognition that we all experience our illnesses not in hospitals, not in clinics, but in our homes, in our offices, and out in the outside world. And that's where we experience illness, and that's where we need to manage the illness. And what are the things that are going on in those environments that make it so we can't manage our illness? And that's a change in thinking. It's a primary prevention approach. It's a preventive care approach. And if you can include that, if you can integrate that in, you should see healthcare costs drop. You should see people using less healthcare services, and then when you really do need the services, they are there and it's more cost effective. That's the idea, that's the concept, that's the shift that is slowly happening, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that in this discussion.
You got to look at the attic. The attic is probably one of the biggest factors in spray foam insulation, and you got to know the condition of the attic. You've got to know the condition and the design of the mechanical system. It's not the same as a normal house when you seal the house up. So the mechanical system inspection is very critical. And then sample collection for spray foam. And again, this has nothing to do with air samples. This is sampling the spray foam. The way you determine whether or not spray foam is installed correctly is by sampling the foam itself and looking at it. And I don't mean a little handful. I don't mean a pinch. I don't mean a core sample. I mean a chunk of it. Truss to truss, stud to stud, 2 foot by 2 foot or 16 by 16. Anything smaller, you're wasting your time. And you got to take several of them. So let's cut to it. I'm going to kind of zip through some of this boilerplate because the content of the conversation will be had at the end. So we know that
when you take that sample, how do you replace that particular?
I'll get to that when we get there, but that's a very good question. So we know that spray foam is taking off because everybody wants to be green, everybody wants to save money, and the best way to save money is to seal your house up tighter than a duck's ass and forget about spending energy dollars. Well, not necessarily true if you do it right. So we know there are problems with the installation, odors, chemical exposure, the argument on what is a conditioned attic and this term that's often used. How many people have heard semi-conditioned attic space? Yeah, there's no such word. That's made up. That's not a reality. Can't find it in the code book. And the ventilation rate. Before we go into the ventilation rate, I'm going to touch about it, but for all the PhDs in here, I don't want any slap fights. I don't want any hair pulling. I'm not going to argue about whether it's too much or too little. I'm just happy as hell that we're talking about it. It wasn't enough. If it's too much, I don't care. That argument is not for me to be had, but I can tell you it wasn't enough. And I'm happy that we're talking about it because more is better when we're talking about this product. And of course, too much of a good thing is always bad. But I'm glad they're talking about it. I'm glad they're kicking it around. I'm glad they got rid of the air infiltration credit. That's as much as I'll say about that until we get further into it.
Now, the relevance to the people in this room is, in my experience, microvac samples reported on a weight basis, but in the ARMI format, are quite common in IAQ practice. And they're collected from many surfaces, couches, bedding, table, every turn, whatever you can mention, I've seen an ARMI score attached to it, okay? So this is what I used to collect the samples we're going to be talking about. 25 millimeter open face cassette held against the carpet, sampling various spots, okay? Very simple approach. Here we have, I think, 20 samples. And what we have is the ARMI score from -10 to +20 and the total fungal concentration in the sample in spore equivalents per 100 square centimeter. And what I've done is just taken from +2.5 to -2.5, just an area around 0, okay, which is a typical ARMI score. And we have a distribution from 700 to 70,000 spore equivalents per 100 square centimeter. Now that's quite a range. As an analytical chemist, it drives me crazy. In addition, I've just highlighted 3 of the samples within this range, okay, circled in red. And here's the 3 samples. We have ARMI scores of 0.72, 0.61, 0.76. So essentially all the same ARMI scores. There's no difference, okay? Group 1 fungi vary from 9,700, 35,000, 59,000. Okay? So for the same ARMI score, I can't believe that the person sitting on this carpet is not getting a difference in exposure potential. Okay? So for the same ARMI score, we have a factor of 6 variation in group 1 fungi. Okay? Now, if I were a treating physician, I think I would want to know that. I think it's important information.
Is there a difference between all of those supposedly hypoallergenic dog breeds? Because non-shedding does not mean they don't shed allergen, right? Hair does not equal allergen. They might still hang on to the hair, but you know they're still spreading allergen. If it comes out, it goes somewhere. So what we found was that dog allergen is detected in the hair and coat of all dog breeds tested, no matter whether they are supposedly hypoallergenic or not. But what we did see also was that within each breed, there's a potentially huge range of allergen levels that they're produced by the individual dogs. So there's much, much more difference between individual dogs, completely irrespective of what breed they belong to. It's an individual to individual thing. Some produce massive amounts, and we saw that some of the supposedly hypoallergenic ones actually produced way more than the shelter mutt. Yeah, so there really was no, and we couldn't detect any difference in the household allergen levels between those different breeds either. So that's, yeah, non-shedding has nothing to do with hyperallergenic. Yes, you might have less hair to clean up, but it doesn't make any difference on the allergen levels. So forget about the hyperallergenic dog. Cats, don't know if any of you have seen any of this. So there's this company still out there who is trying to sell you this special hypoallergenic cat for, they've actually increased the prices recently, for anywhere between 9 and 30 grand. So they got a good deal going there. I mean, this is crazy. And people actually buy this. So I mean, this is, no kidding, needs to fly. So we were approached by ABC, the Lookout, this Nightline program, a few years ago. They called me and said, hey, we found this website. This guy claims all these things. He claims the cats that he has, they don't produce allergen. And even if they produce a little bit of allergen, it doesn't matter, because the allergen that my cats produce is different and the human immune system doesn't react to it. What can we do to prove or disprove these claims? And I thought, let me think about that. So I thought about it for an evening over a glass of wine, and then I called them back and said, all right, let's do this. So I designed this testing protocol and said, all right, this is what we do.
OSHA comes into this because when we select the method by which we're going to do the work, we have workers that are going to go into personal protective equipment based on the remediation approach. So if we're going to put someone up in an attic in Florida in the middle of August, we know that temperature might be, 130 or 140 degrees we were talking about yesterday. We know what the humidity is going to be like. And we know just wearing that equipment puts stress on workers, and the heat also puts stress on workers. Actually, 4,000 people die in the United States on an annual basis due to heat stress. And a lot of those people are doing something physical when they die. You know, they're athletes, they're workers that are doing physical work. One of the things that has always bothered me is I think that in certain situations the threat of the heat to the workers exceeds the threat of the mold to the workers. But when we go back to industry standards, industry recommendations about how we're supposed to do what we do, we just really don't question it, we just do it. So if we think, what is the origin of our methods? Think about the people that put those methods together. They're just like us. They're in a room, and I asked you at the beginning, the first question was, where are we going to go to dinner tonight? And we're really not sure, because everyone has different issues. Everyone has different biases. Everyone has different wants, needs, and preferences. So when we have this standard, it's really a consensus document, or it's supposed to be. You know, many of you have seen that picture of the camel that's the animal designed, you know, by the committee, and I think in many ways that's what we have with S520. You know, Pittsburgh is known for the Steelers, even though they were a little embarrassing yesterday evening. Pittsburgh is not known for hurricanes, but it's interesting that we're concerned now about potential hurricane damage, you know, to the Mid-Atlantic region based on Joaquin and other things that are behind it.
And I'll just point out real quickly, this is a middle school, this is a high school, this is an alternative school. We don't know much about these particular facilities because generally when they get to a certain age, the nurses allow them to self-medicate. They are not going to the clinic or the nurse's office to get their inhaler puff. So we really have no idea what is going on in terms of asthma management in some of those schools.
Can I clarify, what is a clinic?
Just, we're going to say at the health office, the nurse's office, I just call it a clinic. Yeah. Nope. Good thing. We're just calling this, I just call that the health room, nurse's office, whatever you guys want to refer to it as. It's an environmental disease, so we can control these things. With the HEPA study, we were obviously looking at particulates. We actually had some interesting results on dust mites and some other things, again, that the vacuum may help with. We've already talked about very briefly about how cat and dog allergen is brought in. I just wanted to run through some of that information. And again, it is not just their hair. It's the saliva, the dander, the skin flakes, urine, and then the litter dust as well that we're basically bringing in. What I did, and I'm going to try to get to this real quick, I set up 3 particular zones in a school building. Each had about 7 or 8 classrooms and then 1 or 2 offices in each of these different areas. Zone 1 was a control, and they used their existing vacuum, which was a standard commercial upright. Zones 2 and 3, we basically introduced, and this is what we actually had for a grant study. This was one of the limitations of the study. We could have had a better HEPA vacuum. This is low end on the cost scale. It was highly ranked by consumer reports, etc. But again, we were providing these in homes, so I pinched a couple from a grant we used to plop into the schools here. These were less than $150, so they're relatively cheap, and I know there's better ones out there. So what we did is we took their vacuums away in Zone 2 and Zone 3. What I did at the start of the study is I took an allergen sample, and this is a vacuum allergen analyzed for 5 different allergens: cat, dog, dust mite, cockroach, and rodent. And I took a sample in each of these rooms, 9 square feet, we analyzed it. Then we introduced, and that was basically our baseline information. Then we introduced the HEPA vacs in these zones for 2 months. And I was going back and collecting a vacuum bag at the end of every week on Friday. I didn't want to wait till Monday just because of microproliferation. I wanted to catch it at the end of the week when they were done, get it in for analysis.